So I offered to teach a new course to go with our sociology urban studies major that was introduced a couple of years ago, just on the city of Jerusalem. And I asked my students the question, what do we mean by holy? And really it was surprising to me that the students really hadn't ever thought about this question. So I taught the course for a whole semester. Obviously, I can't cover everything today that I covered in that course, but think about, where does the word holy and what do we mean by sacred, where do those concepts come up in the Bible? And just to make it easy, I'm going to give you the answers because this is a lecture and it's not a course or a seminar. Of course, the Lord created the Sabbath day and made it holy. And what does that mean? He set it aside as a special time, as it were, a special temple, like Rabbi Heschel says, a temple built in time. The Sabbath is very precious to those of us from the Jewish persuasion. And then the second time that we come up with the idea of holiness is when Moses approached the burning bush. And he was told to take off his shoes because he was entering into a sacred place. Why was it sacred? Because God is present in that place. So in the Old Testament, we learn a lot about God abiding with the people. He started out by revealing himself, of course, as we know, our biblical history. We are going to be talking a little bit about Abraham, who came to Jerusalem, and he didn't go there quite as a stranger. And I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a Bible scholar, but I'm a student of the Bible, and I've been reading up on the mysterious figure of Melchizedek. And there are a lot of different views about who was this king that Abraham offered salt and bread to. And after poring over all of these commentaries that my son Sam, the Bible studies major, had piled up in his room, I discovered that some scholars have thought that this is actually Shem, the son of Noah, who apparently he may have had a very long life, or maybe he had a line of righteous kings who knew the Lord God, okay? But we know that the children of Israel didn't stay in Canaan, but they went to Egypt, and they resided there and became slaves. And 400 years later, the Lord called them out of Egypt because he had a task for them to do. So this weekend, we're going to be celebrating the Passover Seder to commemorate what was going on with that whole story of the Exodus. But we're going to fast forward, and we're going to say that when Joshua and the children of Israel returned to Canaan, we no longer find Shem or Melchizedek present. Instead, we have other gods that are being worshipped there. And of course, this is not my field again, but the god of flood, chaos, and water was one of the gods that was very powerful. Shh, thank you. It's very distracting. Thank you. It was a god that people were worshiping, who later in the Bible we read were asking people to pass their children through fire. So these were ungodly people who God was judging and was using the Israelites to conquer that land, to re-sanctify it for his name's sake. That's how I understand it. And so that's where I want to begin tonight's journey, really, because what I've done is I've tried to focus on the arts. And so enter with me into architectural history and art history, and let's see what we can learn. First of all, I want to introduce you to a new word, and the word is martyrium. Martyrium is a Latin word, and we have the word martyr from it. And a martyr is a witness who sees something and testifies to its truth. And a martyr also is someone who dies for that truth, who's willing to die for that truth. And a martyrium is a special kind of building. It's a building that is a place of remembrance, a place where the presence of God was made manifest to the nations in the Old Testament. Earlier this month, we heard Joel Kotkin speak. He's a renowned urban historian. He said, without the notion of sacred space, it's doubtful cities could have ever developed anywhere in the world. And yet, this renowned urban historian discussing the sacred as essential to the city did not refer to Jerusalem. And it too, like the sacred cities he mentioned, Beijing and the Mexican city that I'm not going to pronounce, is based on a revelation of a celestial plan. But that revelation is from the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. So let's talk a little bit about the presence of the Lord. I've tried to use photographs that I've taken over the past several years, and this is a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant on wheels, and this is found at Capernaum. Oh, there I go. Okay, sorry. There it is. I took that picture at Capernaum, and you can see this too. It's a depiction of the Ark as it would have traveled from place to place. So it wasn't the place that was holy, it was the Ark that was the presence. It represented the presence of the Lord, and it moved from place to place. But eventually, as you know, David created a city, the city of David, in what we now know as Jerusalem. And so I'm going to refer to some recent digs in the city of David. And this is a famous structure that many people have discussed, and it is very likely that this city of David dates from the time of David. I'm fairly convinced that it's true. And as you reveal things and tear away the layers in archaeology, you reveal many things. One thing that has been revealed in the city of David is an enormous pre-Israelite water works. And these are the enormous rocks that were used to build a tower to protect a spring, which is called the Siloam Spring. And this connects with those gods of the underworld, the flood and the water. And this is very important in the iconography of Christianity. And we're going to be talking about this idea of the conquest of Sheol, the underworld, and the gods of chaos and flood and destruction. And so what does the floor fountain of faith have to do with Jerusalem? Well, tonight you're going to be able to answer that question, because an octagon is extremely important. Now, I've been going back and forth to the Holy Land for many, many years, and I've often gone to Capernaum, which is a place where Jesus was preaching in his day, and Peter's mother lived there, and as you know, he visited Peter's mother's house, and that became a house church in the Christian era. In the early Byzantine period, the Byzantines started building these octagonal churches, house churches, small churches built over house churches to commemorate where important things in Jesus' life occurred. And so this house church is a great example of the use of the octagon. And then the most famous octagon, of course, is in Jerusalem. And here's a map of the city of Jerusalem. And here's the here's the famous Dome of the Rock that is now there. And this building's shape is a Christian martyrium. It was built by the Muslims after the Islamic conquest, but Islam had not yet solidified into a different religion. The first 100 years, and this was built in 691, the conquest of Jerusalem was in about 636. Who were the builders that the Muslims could use to build these structures? But of course, Byzantine Christians who were living in the area and had been building this kind of structure in many different places. And so I'm going to show you a quote, which is hard for me to see. The PLO appointed Mufti of Jerusalem had been preaching hate against the Jews and their religion from the pulpit of Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the Arabic term for the place of prayer at the furthest point. This is the name of Jerusalem as it's used in the Quran. And the idea has been to prove that there is no evidence that Solomon's temple was in Jerusalem. Probably it was in Bethlehem or some other place. So there's been an attempt among some Muslims that we call Salafi Muslims, who are literalists. They read the Quran literally, and they reject Muslim history as well as a lot of other stuff. So this happened in 2000, And the reason for this was the very Oslo Peace Accord process that we've been reading about over the years, because one of the ideas was that the Muslims would get the top of the Temple Mount, the Jews would get underneath the Temple Mount, and the Muslims did not like that idea, so they wanted to reclaim the entire mountain for Islamic preeminence. So an Egyptian head of Al-Azhar, the famous Muslim university, the oldest and most famous Muslim university in the world, said that, of course, in Muslim history, we know that Solomon's house existed in Jerusalem. And here we have a booklet that a Qadi in Jerusalem gave to me. That's why he's got his grandchildren's scrawls all over it. But this dates from 1935 and was published by the Muslim Waqf. And it shows that, actually, can you read that? It says that actually Solomon's temple was located here. So back in the 30s, the Muslims were very comfortable recognizing that Solomon's temple was there. But now, because of the politics of the situation, radical Islam has become very amnesiac and has no longer recognized the history of God's people before Islam. Now, here is a picture of the big rock for which the Dome of the Rock is named. And the rock, many people believe, is where the Holy of Holies was. We're not convinced of this, but it is possible that this was the place, and this is the rock that the Dome of the Rock is built over. And here's a plan of the Dome of the Rock. It shows you the octagon around this place. So why did this become an important place in Islamic history? Well, Muslims will tell you today because this is the place where Muhammad was ascended to heaven and had a fabulous interaction with many people along the way. And so I'm going to tell you about that ascent into heaven and the people that he met in heaven as part of this lecture. So today, this is what the Temple Mount looks like from afar. So I just want to identify the two main buildings here. The little silver dome is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's a Friday mosque or a congregational mosque. And this is where thousands of people can come together to pray for the Friday prayers. The Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. The Dome of the Rock is the martyrium, an event, a place where something really important happened. So the question is, why did Muhammad come to Jerusalem? What important thing drew him there, if that story has any reason for our interest? So, this is a shot I took this past January, and it just shows another possible location for what became the temple area in the Solomonic period. We don't know exactly where it was, but we do know it was above where David had his house. This is all contested. All of this archaeology is contested, and Palestinian-Israeli conflict is centered on these locations. But let's talk about the holy places in Jerusalem in order to get at why Muhammad would come there. Of course, most of you are familiar with the Western Wall. The Western Wall is known as the Western Wall of the temple that Solomon built, but it really is a Herodian supporting wall. It's not really part of the Solomonic edifice, and it's not really part of the temple edifice, but it dates to Herodian times. So it's a place that's holy to the Jewish people, and it's also known as the Wailing Wall, although with Israel's foundation, they tend to call it the Western Wall rather than the Wailing Wall, because the Jewish people feel that they've been restored to the land and they don't need to wail anymore. As you can see, this is a very hilly area, but if you look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque with that silver dome, if you look below it, there's a large sort of rectangle that's been cleared. Those are steps that may have led into the city in Jesus' time, and many people believe that he would have mounted those steps to go into the temple area. It's very thrilling to experience that. But if you go to Hebron, I went the wrong way. Okay, let me go. Oh, there we go. If you go to Hebron, which I don't recommend, it's a very difficult place to visit. But the Herodian walls still stand, and the cave of Machpelah, or the cave of the patriarchs, where the patriarchs and the matriarchs are buried, are inside this edifice. And it's always been a contested sacred space. The Jews continue to worship there, and so do the Muslims. There's been a lot of politics and history, some of it quite tragic, but I'm not going to go into that. But I want you to look at the structure, because it gives us some idea of what the architecture of the Herodian Temple Mount would have looked like. And you can see these vertical columns decorating the outside, and then here's a close-up of the walls, which have the famous Herodian margin around them. So not too many people are able to get in to see this building. But as you know, in 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, and this is a pile of boulders that were thrown down during the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, in which tens of thousands of people were killed. And here's a close-up of Jewish people praying at the Wailing Wall, actually mourning the destruction of the temple, for which they do have a great deal of emotion. But then Christianity came along. And Christianity said, well, we have superseded Judaism and the Mosaic Law, and God's work with Israel is finished, and now we have a better place to worship, and that's the empty tomb. And this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as it looks today. But this building has gone through so many changes. Let me draw a picture of what this building is like for you. Inside there is a dome, and there is an octagonal shape deep inside of it. But over the centuries, the building has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times. Most famously, it was destroyed in 1071, I believe, by the Caliph al-Hakim, who was a Shiite leader in Egypt, and he took a sudden turn and just decided he really hated the Jews and the Christians, and he just came and tore down the walls of the city of Jerusalem and destroyed it. That was the beginning of the Crusades, and so the Crusaders came and rebuilt it and reconquered the area so that Christians could continue to take the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, in Ravenna, Italy, there's a building that is based upon the Church of the Holy Sepulchre during the Middle Ages. And so this gives us a sense of what the plan of that building is like. And just to remind you, it's very much like the martyrium that I showed you in Capernaum. And here we have some pictures of the original structure in Capernaum. So you can see the octagon shape very well right there in all of these pictures. Now, there are other famous octagons as well. They're hard to get to, and there's one on Mount Gerizim, which is up very high. I got a little height sickness from it, you know. It was really windy and kind of scary, but there was a gigantic church up there in the Byzantine period, and it too is a martyrium, and very interesting. So now I'm going to take you back to Jerusalem, back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just to remind you that other buildings were built. In 1151, there was a Norman round church that was built in Cambridge, and it too is based on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you can go to these various buildings all over the world to see what the Church of the Holy Sepulchre would have felt like. And so rather than worshiping at the Temple Mount, as the Jews had, Christians were drawn especially to the Church of the Empty Tomb. Bernard of Clairvaux never actually went there, but he wrote about why Christians would be drawn to the empty tomb. And he said something quite meaningful, which is that when a Christian visits the empty tomb, he's visiting his own tomb as well, because in the hope and belief in the resurrection, right? But there is a negative to this, and that is that the Jews could not continue to live in Jerusalem under the Byzantines and under Christian rule. Under the Muslims, they were permitted to return. So now I'm going to turn to the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is one of the most important buildings in the history of mankind, and it is filled with amazing things. So first I want to share some of the qualities of the building that are very unique. These pictures are of thinly sliced marble that, as you can see, there's a pattern. So they decorated the interior. You'll see this also in Hebron and in Damascus at the Umayyad Mosque, which was once a Christian church. So this is a Byzantine style. After the Dome of the Rock and the church in Damascus, you never see this kind of thing again. Another interesting thing is that all of the exterior tiles on the outside of the Dome of the Rock are quite beautiful, but they're all done by Armenian Christians, because Armenian Christians developed this style of pottery in pre-Islamic times, and it was highly developed in Islamic times. So the Christian families that excelled at this were brought in by the Sultan to redecorate the Dome of the Rock over many centuries, starting in the 16th century with Suleiman the Magnificent. And those families are now living in Jerusalem, and they have pottery factories, and you can go and buy and visit these shops of the descendants of these families. This is the Dome of the Rock, the interior, and you can see that there's calligraphy around the drum of the dome as well as in the dome itself. And I'm going to be sharing just some of the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock for you to see. But let's go back to what Muslims are saying, just in order to get a handle on the ferment within the Muslim world about Jerusalem. I think this is something that's not understood at all in the West, and it's very important. So there are two sides now. There are some Muslims, the Salafis, the Wahhabis, Al-Qaeda, all the bad guys, who deny biblical history entirely. And then there are those Muslims who are more traditional, who still have some respect for Islamic history itself, and they want to promote this kind of biblical connection with the people of the book. So how do I know about this? I've met many Muslim background believers over the years that I've been here at Biola, and they've come and shared with me their views of this story. And this information is one of the reasons why so many Muslims are turning to Jesus in these very dark times in the Islamic world. And that gives us a reason for hope, I believe. So here's an example. Nihad Saeed, a dear guy who's become an American citizen and now has a new name, but he helped to develop tourism in the Sinai during the Sadat years. And after Sadat was assassinated by the radicals, they then started to attack a lot of other Muslims who supported peace with Israel. And Nihad was one of the people who had to flee for his life. So this is a political issue in the Islamic world. Umar in Jerusalem. So when I teach Islamic history, I use primary source documents in order to teach my students about Islamic history, and of course it's all in English. But this is an example published and translated by Bernard Lewis, and this is what we call a hadith. A hadith is a tradition that amplifies the Quran. And this hadith talks about a fellow named Raja ibn Hawa, who was a Jew, who converted to Islam, and he accompanied Umar, who conquered Jerusalem. And when they got up to the Temple Mount area, Raja ibn Hawa took off his shoes, just as Muslims do today. And Umar saw him do this, and he said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, this is holy ground." And they had a little discussion. He says, "I want to feel the touch of it beneath my feet." And Umar says, "Well, you think this is holy ground, don't you?" And so Raja says, "Yes, this is holy ground." And so Umar, who was a very tall man who wore very simple, sort of ratty clothing, he was a very humble guy, bent down and started to take away all of the garbage that had begun to accumulate over the period from the Roman to the Byzantine era, where all the refuse of the city was piling up. And they started to cleanse the temple area, and indeed, they re-sanctified it. And so at the time, Jewish people really appreciated Islam because they were able to return to Jerusalem. It's quite different than today, isn't it? In the dome, you'll see this is the Arabic word for God. And you'll see this in many places in the inscriptions. This is Arabic Christian terminology that was imported into the Quran. So when you have an Arab New Testament or an Arab Old Testament, you will read the word Allah for God, for Jehovah. So this is still true, and many people argue about, well, who is Allah? It's a very interesting question. You can learn a lot by discussing it. But at this time, I do believe that the Muslims who were interacting with the Jews saw this as the same God, not two different gods. Also, this is a photograph of the interior of the Dome of the Rock, and it has a number of different motifs that I want to point out to you. First of all, right away, you're going to see crowns, because this is the throne of God. This is where God, in Muslim belief, as in other, even in Jewish belief, God is going to judge the world. And so crowns, these are Sasanian and Byzantine style crowns, so they're historically accurate, so to speak. And when we look at the close-ups, you're going to see these large pearls and, great wealth, sort of to get across the idea of sovereignty and majesty. And this is a picture of paradise based upon Christian thinkers like St. Ephrem of Syria and Edessa and Nisibis. These are towns that we don't know about, but were once extremely important in Christian history. Another motif that you can see as I go through these pictures is going to be of the Garden of Eden and paradise. And so this is a very important idea. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about the 70 virgins. Are they 70 virgins? Or are they crystallized white grapes? This is an actual scholarly argument that's going on right now, and we'll hear about it. So here's a picture of a man going through the prayer postures of Islam, but many of these postures, as taking off your shoes on holy ground, prostration, and so on, those were known among Jews and Christians as well. So these were not, at the time, viewed as an innovation, but because Muslims took this over, Jews and Christians, for the most part, have stopped doing this. Here's a good example of water. And water is an important motif, as I've said, connected with the temple and the reconquest of Jerusalem because of the waters that bubble up in the Pool of Siloam and in the waterworks in the ancient city. And so water here is not a frightening thing. It's part of the creative life, the living water, so to speak. And here are some inscriptions that I'm going to translate for you. Here's one of them. God is indeed my Lord as well as your Lord. So serve and worship your Lord. This is the straight path of righteousness. And here's an urn from Capernaum showing a cluster of grapes and an urn and some plant material similar to what you saw in the mosaic from the Dome of the Rock. Here's a tree. Now, trees are an important part of the iconography in the Dome of the Rock. And the idea is that you're walking into a planted, cultivated garden. So this is not a wild wilderness that needs to be reclaimed. This is a cultivated garden that is a place of serenity and delight. But there are some other things going on here as well. Another inscription is this: the religion before God is surrender. The people who were given the books did not argue about this until after receiving knowledge, and they became envious of one another. Whosoever denies the signs of God, God is swift in judgment. If you do read the Quran, you're going to get the idea that the main purpose of the Quran is to warn people that God is going to destroy them if they don't follow God. And the Quran points to many civilizations that were judged in the past and the people are no more. It's a very powerful reminder of the importance of judgment in Islam. And here's one of those crowns. So each of those gems is priceless. You know, the value of these pearls in the ancient world would have been beyond measure. So this is the wealthiest, this is the most lavish of all the gems and jewels in the whole world. Here's another inscription. It says, "In the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful, no God exists but God alone. Indivisible without peer. Say, God is one, God is central, birthing no child, nor birthed in turn. Nothing and no one is comparable. Muhammad is a messenger of God, the Lord God bless him." I'm sharing this with you because it's obviously very anti-Trinitarian. My dissertation advisor, who's a specialist in the early Arab conquests, wrote a book called Muhammad and the Believers that came out a couple of years ago, published by Harvard. And in the book, he argues that actually Islam, as it first began, was an anti-Trinitarian movement. But in those days, people didn't understand the Trinity. So they didn't have Fred Sanders, to explain the Trinity to them. So instead, what they were really arguing against, as you see these inscriptions, is that God had had some kind of carnal relationship with Mary and had given birth to a son, which to them, they took very literally and were offended by it. And being good Semites, the Arabs would have had good reason, to be offended by such an image. So here's another crown just to kind of break things up a little bit, but this one has some botanical references and flowers and so on. But here's another one on Jesus. "O God, bless your messenger and servant Jesus, son of Mary. Peace be upon him the day he was born, the day he dies, and the day he is raised again. Say only the truth about Jesus over whom you dispute. He is the son of Mary. It is not fitting that God should beget or father a child. Glory be unto God. When God ordains a matter, God merely says to it, be, and it is." So it doesn't even deny the virgin birth. They believe that Mary is a virgin, and they believe that Jesus is going to come back again, but they don't believe that he was actually killed on the cross. And there was a heresy circulating in those days about Jesus not really dying on the cross, but someone who looked like him. And so he was raptured, so to speak, up into heaven and is going to return to judge the quick and the dead. So here's that image again. I think I am repeating. "So believe in God and all the messengers and stop talking about the Trinity. Cease in your own best interest. Verily God is the God of unity. Lord Almighty, that God should beget a child, either in the heavens or on the earth, God alone is the best protector." These are the most ancient Quranic verses that we have attested. Okay, here we go. Here's another botanical form. And then, "O people of the book, don't be excessive in the name of your faith. Don't say things about God but the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, is indeed a messenger of God. The Almighty extended a word to Mary and a spirit too." And these go on. And so I've now created a sort of understanding in you that this magnificent structure is all about Jesus. And the thing is that now the Muslims are going to try to straighten out how the Christians are interpreting Jesus. So that's a big surprise. This is not a building about Muhammad, really. And in fact, there's even some discussion among scholars that the praised one or the blessed servant of God doesn't refer to a person at all. But now I'm going to take you into another realm of art in order to really make you start thinking about this. And what I'm going to be using is the miraculous journey of Muhammad, called the Mirajnameh, which is a Uyghur manuscript. The Uyghurs are a people in Western China, and before they were converted to Islam, they were Nestorian Christians. We often don't realize that in Central Asia and going all the way to the east, Christian missionaries who typically were Nestorians, who spoke Syriac and wrote Syriac, made it all the way to the east, and many people became Christians. But then when Islam came, the Nestorian doctrines were weak in the area of theology concerning the Trinity and some other things, and they easily were converted to Islam. So this manuscript is a Uyghur document, and if you want more details on the manuscript itself, I can give that to you. But for now, let's enter into the manuscript. And I'm not covering everything. First of all, this is just a picture of the righteous women of Islam, surprise, who usually you hear that in Islam women can't go to heaven, but here they are in an octagon. And I just wanted to start with that because it kind of picks up with what I've been sharing with you. I'm going to skip that. And here we have the angel Gabriel appearing to the prophet. So Muslims believe in the angels, and as you know, if you've taken anything with Dr. Finley, you know all about the angels in Daniel and all of this angelology. So the Muslims picked up a lot of that, and Gabriel is a really important angel. So in the life of Muhammad, there's a story that Gabriel comes to him as he's sleeping. So there he is sort of in bed. And Muhammad is depicted with what we would have a halo, but they have this very Chinese-y looking, you know, fire symbol. And so the angel Gabriel takes him on the night journey. And here he is flying through the earthly skies from Arabia to Jerusalem. And you can see all of the angels. And I love the iconography here because you really have an Eastern sense. This is not Western art. This is completely different. And so there he is flying through the sky, and then he lands, and he enters the sacred mosque at Jerusalem. Now, this Uyghur manuscript assumes that there was a building in Jerusalem. Obviously, even Sheikh Tantawi said, obviously, there was no building when Muhammad went there, but instead he just went to the rock. But in the Uyghur imagination, here he is in the mosque. Now, in this, he's going to be meeting a lot of prophets from the Old Testament, and that's what we're really going to be studying. But let me point out a couple of other points. In a mosque, the mosque lamp represents the presence of God. So in any Muslim art, including rugs, you know, with prayer carpets, you'll usually see the lamp as a symbol of God, and light is a universal symbol for God, and this blazing fire around the prophets. And then you see in the doorway some angels kind of whispering about what's going on. Then here's Abraham, who has asked Muhammad to serve as the imam, in other words, the prayer leader. All imam means is the man who stands in front and leads the people in prayer. So then we go on, and here's the very first stop, so to speak. He's going to the Kauthar River, which is one of the 4 rivers of heaven. These are the Tigris, the Euphrates, and these rivers flow with water, milk, wine, and honey. These are images that are drawn from the Syriac poetic tradition as well. You'll find this kind of thing in the culture that Muhammad was born into. Here he's going to the first heaven, and here he meets Adam. Now, there are many Jewish legends relating to the dome, Evan Hashatiyah, the foundation stone of the world. And one of them is that Adam was created there. And another is that Abraham almost sacrificed his son there. So there are a lot of different allusions going on here, but Adam is the first prophet. Now, I didn't have a good picture to throw in here, but the Ottoman sultans had genealogies of their family, and they traced themselves back to Adam. They didn't, deny the biblical background of their faith, which is what the Salafi Muslims do today. Here, Muhammad is arriving at the second heaven, which is made of white pearls. And there are some angels. So Dante has the 7 levels of heaven. This is where it comes from. These are the ideas that were circulating. Christians in the medieval world learned about the Muslim beliefs which tie into Jewish beliefs. It's so cool. I just have some verses that have to do with angels here, but let's move on. Now I want you to notice that this large angel is the angel of death, and the angel of death is wearing a crazy hat made of feathers that look like wings. And this is a motif that you find also in the Dome of the Rock, this idea of winged urns. And there's something going on here in Eastern art that represents something very important to the Uyghur people. This is an area for research for someone who does Eastern art. But here we have this winged urn in the Dome of the Rock, and you can see it has these wings up there, and then you have these beautifully enjeweled urns. And in my research, when I was doing my research on Jerusalem in the 1830s, I read about an incident where a Jewish kid broke into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and broke one of these kinds of windows. And there, in the court record that I read about how it's made and how people didn't really know how to repair it because it had been such a long time since these windows had been fashioned. And so they are made out of gypsum, they say. And so I'll let your imagination run with that. They're quite unique. Well, then here's the angel of prayer. I think the angel of prayer is totally awesome because he's got 70 faces. And the 70 faces to me represent the nations. So this angel with 70 faces represents all of the people of the world praying and probably glorifying the Lord. I think that's just totally cool. And also down in the bottom quadrant of the manuscript, you see the prophets John and Zacharias. So we've got New Testament prophets as well. And here you have him meeting Jacob and Joseph. Now, all of these people are wearing the same kinds of clothing. And that's a distinctive aspect of Islamic costume. They have great variety in their fabrics, but great uniformity in their styles. Later in history, Western visitors to the East would remark that their clothing is so much more attractive and it doesn't reveal the human form the way Western clothing does. And yet there's this sense of order because everyone is basically wearing the same clothing. So you have this sort of nice balance. Now, I know many of you have heard that Muslims don't use representational art. And I'm sure that you've been noticing this is representational art, and Muhammad even his face shows. So that just shows you the kind of diversity even in artistic forms in the Islamic world. Here we're moving up in the echelon of importance, and here Muhammad is being introduced to David and Solomon in heaven. And now he's, sorry. Now he's meeting Noah and another prophet that we don't know named Idris. There are a number of prophets in the Quran that we don't know, but I take them to be sort of saints rather than prophets, and they're just important in the Arab culture. I don't know enough about them to be able to remark much more than that. No one really does. Here now he's approaching the most important of the prophets, and that is Moses. And there's a long story in the night journey and ascension where Muhammad is going to go up into heaven and have a discussion with Moses. And the question is, how many times should Muslims pray every day? And Jewish people pray 3 times a day. And Muhammad starts out by asking, well, how about if my people pray 50 times a day? You know, that would show God how much more devout we are. And Moses is like, you know, get over it. It's never going to happen. You have to reduce the number. And they keep going back and forth, 40, 30, 20. Finally, they settle on 5 because it's more than the Jews. And so it probably will work. And that's what Moses contributed to this discussion. Also notice that in heaven, there are many mansions. And Moses has a nice mansion. Now you have Muhammad ascending into the higher heavens, the 7th heaven, which is made of light. And gold is the representation for pure light, and he is in the presence of God. You can still see the angel Gabriel, and yet you know that he's on his way to the throne of God. I think this is a little out of order, sorry people. Here he's visiting the mansion of Abraham. So he's very excited to be meeting Abraham, who's so important to the Muslims. And then he would have gone up into the seventh heaven. Now, we also find in this manuscript that Muhammad went to hell. And I'm not going to go into all of the sins that Muslims believe you're punished for, but I want to take you to see, actually I have a few more. This isn't hell yet. This is still on the shores of the Black Sea. This is the angel with 70 heads. I really wanted to focus on this. You can't see it very well when we scan this image. It didn't come out as clearly, but you have 4 heads. And the 4 heads are analogous to some of the other iconography that we're more familiar with in Christianity, having to do with the 4 apostles, right? And if you want some specific background on this, I can go into it. But here's a slide that shows that where the Christians got that idea actually is Old Testament, because you have these animals that represent different tribes. And when the tribes were arrayed in the desert outside the tabernacle, they were arrayed by tribe, and each tribe had a banner. And so these are tribal banners. And you know, this is so interesting, I think, because here's the book of the cows, and it picks up the same imagery. So those apostles represent the whole world again. And you have this in Islamic art, and you have this in Christian art, and I don't think that there's actually Jewish art depicting the Old Testament in the same way, because no graven images and all of that, but it's in the scriptures. And this is, I think, quite fascinating. Another thing that's interesting is in heaven, there's a tree that is encrusted with jewels. And so this is another symbol of that paradise. Here he is talking with Moses about the 5 daily prayers. And I think I have here he is worshiping the Eternal. And then I wanted to include some slides showing the Houris. So again, if you read St. Ephraim, paradise does contain all of these virgins, and it's quite interesting, and because they're the righteous ones, they're the ones who are pure, and it doesn't really have to do with your earthly life, it has to do with your moral state. So if you want to read St. Ephraim to understand the role of virgins, male and female, in Christian ideas about paradise, go for it. The Muslim idea is a little bit more what we would call carnal, because sex apparently occurs in the Muslim heaven, but it's very interesting to read about this, and virginity is perpetual. So even if you engage in a sexual act, you're still a virgin. Anyway, that is how they understand it. I'm just reporting what I read. I don't say that this is true. Here's another depiction as he's approaching the throne of God. And then finally, this is a depiction of the importance of the role of the leader, because the leader of the Muslims, who's depicted here as Muhammad with the white-robed Muslims, is actually responsible for their ultimate eternal fate. All the people on the outside who are kind of in dark clothing, they're the damned. They're not going to make it into heaven, whereas the followers of Muhammad are hoping that he's right about all of this, because if he's wrong, they're going to be going also to hell. And that's one of the interesting beliefs. So this quote is for you. Muhammad is a messenger of God. May the Lord bless him, and come the day of resurrection, accept his intercession on behalf of his own community. This indicates to us that they're not certain about their eternal fate. So hell is an important image, and here we have Muhammad riding on his miraculous beast, Al-Burak, who I haven't talked to you about, but she's a female face with the body of a horse and the tail of a lion. Anyway, here are some demons guarding the gates of hell, and here are some representative punishments. of hell. These are just different punishments for different bad things that human beings do. Nasty punishments. Now, before Gabriel leaves Muhammad, Muhammad asks for a favor. And he says, Gabriel, you've been with me and I've enjoyed seeing you, but can I see you as you really are? And Gabriel's like, well, if I showed you, you'd be too scared because I'm really big and I'm frightening. And Muhammad says, no, I'm just dying to see you as you really are. So that's the big Gabriel. That's supposed to show how gigantic and miraculous he was. Here's another scripture or inscription in the Dome of the Rock. And I think this is very interesting. The religion before God is surrender. The people who were given the books did not argue about this until after receiving knowledge, and they became envious of one another. Whoever denies the signs of God, God is swift in judgment. Barry Kramus, in his introduction to the Amundsen catalog that came out, writes, the veil between time and eternity is drawn aside. I'm so sorry. This is actually Thomas Howard, who Dr. Kramus quoted. So first is Thomas Howard. The veil between time and eternity is drawn aside, and we are here in a past eternity. This is the thing. When you go to these holy places that commemorate the action of God in space and time, you in some way enter into that event. Even though it's in the past, by going there, you're participating in it. So pilgrimage is such an important part of sacred place that to go to these places, to walk them, suddenly you can imagine that you were on the road with Jesus as he was ascending up to Jerusalem. You can imagine various episodes in the Bible in a way that you really can't do just in your imagination. And this location, this picture is from a low point where you can look up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and you can see before you all of these mikvah pools, which are immersion pools. In Judaism, they don't have baptism, but they have ritual baths, and it's done quite frequently because you want to be ritually pure, and it's very complicated, but you must do a ritual bath before you go up to the temple. And the Pool of Siloam has been revealed so that now pilgrims can do something that really they didn't know they could do in the past. It was always there, but it's been buried by debris for so many centuries. Now you can go to where the Pool of Siloam is and then ascend up to the Temple Mount area on your own 2 feet and follow in the footsteps of all of the people who would have been doing the very same thing in the days of the temple. And I want to show you another slide. This is from the Bamberg Cathedral, a very anti-Semitic cathedral in Germany. And I went there to take pictures of this depiction of synagogue and ecclesia, two classical anti-Semitic sort of symbols that we've always studied. But I was really taken with this doorway because what you see there is Christ enthroned, and below him is hell. And it shows that God conquered death. You know, this is so symbolic that Jesus actually did enter the temple. You know your New Testament. You know that Jesus came in as a babe to be dedicated, that later he was found teaching in his Father's house, that he healed there, that he preached there. So the presence of God actually did enter the temple. I don't believe that it was in Christ's calling that the temple had to be destroyed. I think he wept because he knew that it would happen, but it, I think, would have been possible for him to vindicate and to cleanse that temple and to amplify it, but it wasn't the right time because his plan was to die for humanity. So he conquered death and rose again and is coming a second time so that we have this church age that we live in. And so I'll just leave you with our beautiful floor fountain of faith, the living water, and that octagon that is a martyrium. It's a reminder to us that we have to be witnesses of God's action in history. We have to be the eyewitnesses. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there and stand up for the one God that is the God of Israel, that is Jesus Christ, and that is our God today. I think that that's so important. There's so many things you can talk about when you talk about Jerusalem. You can talk about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and what that means in the New Testament era. What's the difference between God abiding and being with his people and for God to actually make us into his temple. But these are so evocative, and when you go and you see these symbols and you see these places, all of a sudden your faith becomes a little bit more real to you. That will edify you like a strongly built tower, and that will help you in your witness to people who don't yet know the Lord. But may he come quickly. In Jesus' name, I end this lecture. Amen. Thank you. If you would like to ask questions, I'm not in a hurry, I can stay. And also in the back, there's a little notebook if you want me to email you some of my publications that actually relate to my lecture. I'd be happy to do that, just write clearly. But do we have any questions? Yes, Tom.
You said something
Dr.
about
Finley.
why was Muhammad coming to Jerusalem? So I'm not sure I heard it. Why was he coming to Jerusalem?
He was coming to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was known as the throne of God worldwide, that they knew of the Temple of Solomon, they knew that that had existed, so he was going there to show his continuity with the Bible and not that he was creating a new religion. I don't think that that was his intention. He, of course, got involved in politics, and the rest is history, as they say. But his original impulse, I don't think, was to create a new religion. He wanted the Jewish people to recognize him in the line of the prophets. The Jewish people didn't accept him as a prophet, and so that's the beginning of some of the theological competition between Jews and Muslims. But then the Christians recognized right away that this was a heresy, that this was anti-Trinitarian, and Christians have always been on their guard about Islam, and I think for some good reason, theologically speaking. But today, unlike many other eras in the past, there's more opportunity for us to build bridges and lead people to Christ. And this form of Salafi Islam is so evil that many people are turning to Christ. And what's interesting is the regions where they're doing that is where there's an underlying Christian culture that they can tap into that's different than the Salafi form of Islam that they have been exposed to in recent decades and in the past century and a half. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Yes, Jared.
What was the name of the manuscript?
It's called The Miraculous Journey of Muhammad, the Miraj Nameh. It's in the Paris National Library. It was published in 1977, but it was actually first published in 1436 in Khorasan. And it's written in Nestorian Syriac writing, as well as Arabic and Persian. Pretty cool, huh? Any other questions? There's so many things we could talk about. Yes?
I have a question. I was wondering, I don't know if you know this, but do you know if Dante may have had access to this?
Yes.
You mentioned it.
I know that this has been attested, that Dante was a very educated person, and living in Italy in those days, there was a lot of interaction between Muslims and Christians, and the Vatican, for example, has many manuscripts and so on, so it would have been very possible, and in fact, it's been proven that there's a connection. Yeah. Did this surprise you? It's a very surprising manuscript. Any challenges of my rather unconventional interpretation? Because I'm a bridge builder, and it's not easy to be a bridge builder in a time of war, you know? Yes, hi.
Hey, speaking of building bridges, it's kind of surprising to me to learn a little bit about the history of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, because there are points in history where there's a lot of, there's not tension between them in the sense that there is today.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what you think, more of a general understanding of that, history that varies a lot, would do in a climate that has so much tension. So my question is, how do you think a better understanding of history would be able to speak into the current conflicts, especially the parts where you kind of see that it wasn't always so hostile and intense?
Right. Well, politics throughout this period, there was always war, and then there were times of peace. So I don't want to make it seem as though that weren't true. However, I think that educating Muslims about their own history is extremely important, and no one is really doing that because this other form of Islam has taken over, and it has a very specific purpose, which is to erase the non-Islamic history that's part of Islamic history and to erase those Muslims who saw things differently. And this has happened many times. For example, you know about Islamic Spain. And Islamic Spain was famous for having a very tolerant, multicultural kind of community, but some of the Arab tribes in North Africa found that to be quite insulting to the Prophet. And so they came in to Spain and basically overturned the more tolerant versions of Islam. And so there's always been internal to Islam very serious and deadly competition between those who have a more of a biblical outlook and perhaps use reason and philosophy more. And they were very important in world history. But what we might consider to be I don't like to misuse words, so I'll go with literalists. The literalists who want to just read the Quran and apply it as if this were still 7th century Mecca, and to follow the most strict form of Islam, which is the Hanbali form of Islam. There are 4 canonical, if you will, schools of Islam, and the Ottomans were the Hanafite rite, which is the most liberal and the most suitable for a reason-based kind of approach towards jurisprudence. And Hanbali is the most rigid and difficult one, and the most misogynist and the most jihad-like. So right now we're living in a time when that's on the ascendance. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Question about
Kevin.
Biola history, since I'm still somewhat new to Biola here. Help me understand the design, the floor fountain. Was some of this intentional? Is this coincidence?
You know, I always have questions like this myself. So I tried to find this out, but it seems to be a detail that nobody has recorded. I think it's kind of random, but it was kind of God that they chose it. But so far I haven't heard that anyone had a clue that an octagon would be especially important. But also I noticed that on the new plaza for the new Talbot building, they've dedicated the plaza to a Muslim person, and I don't know who came up with that idea. And the name of the person is not really a name, it's like an honorific title, and it means the blaze of truth. So obviously a Muslim background believer who became a Christian and had some sort of mission. But I've asked, even Dr. Dirks doesn't know who. Do you? So there are all these little mysteries in Biola's history and are still waiting to be dug out. So good question. So have you been to the City of David and all of those excavations? Isn't it amazing? Yeah, because it's like tearing away the veil. And so a lot of the mystery disappears, but it's very interesting. And it is the most disputed spot, I think, in the whole world. So it's really intensely interesting. And has anybody ever gone through the pool of Hezekiah's tunnel? Yeah. So now they have this big Canaanite waterworks that nobody even knew were there, and you can go through there, and it's immense, and it makes you feel like, who were these people? And that you really feel like the flood, you know, and these demonic, chaotic forces were unleashed somehow in those periods when the Israelite kings were sacrificing to Marduk, you know. It's almost good enough for a movie, right? So that's why I really love this this picture of Jesus. You see, those are little demons in hell, and I love that idea that God has conquered, you know, Satan. Dr. Sosi, when I was working on a book, was interested in getting me to think about big eschatological questions, and he asked me to read Eric Sauer, who has written about how Satan was cast down to earth and man was created to reconquer the earth for God. And I thought that was almost a little bit too above my pay grade to write about, but it has stirred my imagination, and as I've studied the deep, dark history of pre-Davidic Jerusalem, I certainly am more convinced that there's something to that idea, and that really is where Satan was cast down, and that God has been teaching mankind to follow him by using this very special place. So this is where God was, and I find it so troubling that most Christians don't seem to really care about Jerusalem anymore. And we've kind of abdicated our role in being a moderating factor between all of the invested parties in the conflict. And I just think we could do so much more for the good if we cared a little bit more about that city, very circumspectly, knowing of the missteps that Christians have taken in the past. But that's my prayer, that the church would somehow rally around the Palestinians and the Israelis as we're having this conference here, that we would do something extraordinary that would show that this dispensation is really important.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.